Hi, we continue in Genesis 43 today and complete the chapter as we continue through the chiasm that you can see on the right side of the screen that began at the beginning of this chapter 43, 1 to 14, and then continues into the scene we're in now. And we note that this chiasm goes 3 full chapters from the beginning of 43 to the end of 45, paralleling the chiasm that was just simply in chapter 42 that we saw here. Following this sequence from Jacob sending them to the sons reporting back, the arrival in Egypt, departed from Egypt, audience with Joseph, brothers in custody, and a second audience. And so the second chiasm is slowing things down to explore more of intentions, although as I've been noting throughout, scholars who attempt to claim that they know what Joseph's thinking really need to have some more caution, because the text goes out of its way to hide what Joseph's thinking behind the imperial mask. And the brothers don't even know it's him, let alone what he's thinking. And we'll see that his thinking may well change, or at least his strategy changes. So it's a little soon still to decide what Joseph is about here, whether he's trying to reconcile with his brothers, trying to get Benjamin just back, or whether he's even just trying to get his dad to show up via Benjamin. We'll have to figure that out all as we go. There are a number of other elements in this overall themes and structure chart that we want to pay attention to. We've been looking at the question of God, but that doesn't come up in our immediate scene. Will come up at the end of our immediate scene is this set of imperial and social hierarchies, Egyptians versus Hebrews, and the royal elite versus ordinary people, both as you can see in 43:32 that we'll get to today. And I'd like to suggest that's part of one of the elements that the text puts in there to invite the audience, whether they're immediately out of exile or several centuries later under the Hellenistic rule of the Ptolemies in Egypt after Alexander the Great, of what life and empire would be like. Would it be the kind of integrated life that books like Leviticus provide, where one cares for one's neighbors and strangers and takes them into your community? Or, as we'll see here, where everybody eats separately because of either class hierarchies or ethnic hierarchies? So that's one of the elements that's never explicitly made as a judgment, but just paints a picture to suggest, is this really how God wants us to live? So we'll have to pay more attention to those things as we go. So as you continue to look at the chiastic shape of some of the sections here, we're on this section here, this immediate chiastic shape, and then the bottom part is not a chiasm, but as I've highlighted just in the simple underlinings here, there are several words, 2 words in particular, the 3 times in a verse: alone, 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 portions, 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 parallel to the shalom here, which is actually 4 times in this scene, that makes up a little chiasm here. So there's 1 up above and 3 in here, as we'll see as we go. So with that in mind, let's begin to jump right into our scene. So the brothers have been waiting at the door with the servant of the house, who assured them that the loss of the silver and the return of the silver is no big deal, peace to them. So now Joseph comes home while all that's happening, literally into the house, and they brought him the present they had carried into the house and bowed to the ground before him. And that might seem more detailed than we need. All we hear about Joseph is he came home. We could have simply heard they handed the present, but the fact they brought him the present that they had carried in and bowed to the ground is highlighting that they don't know that it's Joseph, that they still believe it's the vizier, and they're doing everything they can to be subservient to him. The bowing to the ground, of course, also echoes the original dream back in chapter 37. And we'll see that a little more here when they bow down again, which is the other side of the chiasm here, because the obeisance word here is doubled, as you can see on the right side there. So let's just jump right into what he says when he encounters them this time. So we hear in passive voice, the narrator's voice, you're not in direct speech, he asked about their shalom. And why the new RSV translates shalom welfare here and well here and well here, I don't know, but it's the same word in all those places, so I translated it that way here as well. And it's important that we have a sense of what shalom is. It's much more than the abstract welfare or even the generic well. Shalom has to do with all the pieces fitting together, whether that's about one's body and what we call health, whether that's the community in the sense of all the Israelites or all the Judahites working together under Yahweh, or whether it's people on the earth, so that the earth is working well, so that food is provided for them and the animals and everything works out. That's what shalom is. So he could be asking it in the deep sense or just simply how you doing kind of sense. We know that Joseph knows how they're doing, but he doesn't know how their father is doing, and that's the hidden message inside this. And notice it comes out loud here after the generic statement about asking how they're doing. Is your father Shalom, the old man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? And the "is he still alive" is wonderfully ironic, because that's what Judah said that the man had said when he reported back to Jacob, but we hadn't heard it yet there. And when Judah repeats it, he'll say the same thing, but this is only when we're actually hearing it here. Is he still alive? And that's a real question for Joseph. Why would the vizier care? This would be another one of those clues that the brothers ought to be thinking, wait a minute here, who is this guy? Because why would this second in command of Egypt care about this random group of Canaanites' father back in the old country, of whether he's alive or not? Especially if the issue was, bring the son, Benjamin, who's here now, why does he still care about the father? But they're still clueless. And I'd like to suggest perhaps their general cluelessness has a lot to do with the cluelessness of the Israelites or Judahites in their centuries under empire in various ways. And they just begin to accept the terms of empire and the questions that empire puts to them, as opposed to the questions that Yahweh would put to them, or the questions they would put to themselves if they understood themselves as being called out of empire, as Abram was and Sarai was back in chapter 12. But that's not what happens here. They're completely obtuse, and they'll stay completely obtuse and settle in Egypt rather than saying, wait a minute, isn't the promise that we go back to the land of Canaan and you should come with us? But that's not what happens. So they answer here, and as Viva Gottlieb Zornberg notes below, their answer echoes Joseph's question perfectly, except for the omission of Hazaken, the old one. Yet in its formality, confirmed by the bowing, it speaks only the minimum, not the depth of Jacob's condition. At this point, they're still hoping to restore both Simeon and Benjamin. Note the difference in the next mention of Shalom in 44:17 that we'll see, after which Judah speaks. And the note is not a quote from Viva Gottlieb Zornberg, but inspired by what she had to say. So they say, your servant is Shalom. And notice the simplicity of how they're saying that there. That well also echoes 29:6. When we saw that Jacob shows up at the well in the old countries and asks about Laban, and they just simply say yes. The word yes here is shalom, even though the NRSV covers it up. So a similar thing there to when Jacob first was encountering the people of the old country, and here it's the other way around. It's the person of the old country, Egypt, the really old country, asking them, and they're the ones who respond in single words, just like the people in Laban's country did back in chapter 29. And so they bowed their heads and did obeisance, yes, obeisance, a doubled verb there, and really highlighting the fulfillment of the dream. And then he looked up and saw. And the phrase lifted, or literally lifted up their eyes and saw, is one that we've seen throughout. And let's look at those, because not just in the way they're described in the bottom left, but as you can see more clearly on this chart, I hope, the various circumstances where people lift up their eyes and see. So first it was Lot seeing the well-watered plain, but interpreting it wrongly, as if that was the good thing, like the garden of God. Then we saw Abraham lifting up his eyes and seeing the three visitors, who were three angels of Yahweh. Then he lifted up his eyes and saw the place where he's going to sacrifice Isaac, except of course he's not, because a few verses later he lifts up his eyes again and saw the ram that is a substitute for his son. Then Isaac went out at the end of the long chapter 24 and lifted his eyes and saw the camels with Rebekah on it. Then we saw in chapter 33 Jacob lifting his eyes and saw his brother Esau coming, which is certainly parallel here to Joseph looking up and seeing his brother coming. The emotional resonance is obviously very different. Jacob is terrified of Esau, and Joseph loves Benjamin, and there's been no animosity between them that we know of, and it's hard to imagine there would be. But certainly Jacob would remember this, but Jacob isn't in the scene right now. And then right after that, Esau lifted up his eyes and saw the women and children, and then they were reconciled. And then we have our scene here. So a whole series of people lifting up their eyes and seeing. But he doesn't just see his brother, he sees his brother Benjamin, his mother's son. And we noted at the beginning of the chapter, it simply said they came and stood before Joseph, or before Joseph's face, and when he saw Benjamin, he sent the servant to deal with them. But there it just simply said Benjamin. Now it's the full deal. He sees his brother Benjamin, specifying his mother's son, distinguishing Benjamin, of course, from all the other half-brothers, and making the point of this all along that this has been about the children of Rachel, both in Jacob's mind and in Joseph's mind. And he says to them, in the face of that recognition, it's amazing he can control himself right there, but in the next verse he can't. Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? He, of course, already knows it is. He's already recognized him. God be gracious to you, my son. And the phrase God be gracious might seem like just an everyday statement, but as Westerman notes below, this is not a common formal greeting. It is a wish that has in mind God's personal attention, as in 33:5 and 11, and the promise in Isaiah 30:19. We won't go back to those now, but Westerman's point is key here, that this is calling for God's personal attention on Benjamin, who he calls my son. So Joseph has become father to his brother. Gracious here, chen, which is used many times in Genesis and throughout the Bible. But with Jacob's prayer that we saw in verse 14, sending them off graciously, as Walter Brueggemann notes, the two lines together frame the movement of Benjamin from one generation to the next, being sent off from his father to his brothers, and now being back with his brothers. And perhaps saying be gracious to Benjamin is speaking against the traditional hostility that had been well known to the readers of the Joseph story from, say, the end of the book of Judges, where the Benjaminites were the ones who didn't care for the concubine of the Levite man, and then a whole series of Benjaminites are killed, and a group of foreigners has to be gathered as women, so the Benjaminite tribe won't die off completely. So there's certainly a solid history of Benjamin being suspicious amongst the tribes, and that's, of course, where Saul came from, who it says God sent an evil spirit on and replaced him with David. But this is a positive statement of Benjamin, and perhaps maybe not just within the story world about Joseph and Benjamin as characters, but about the tribal world that will exist once they get an Exodus when the story's over. And of course, it has existed for hundreds of years before the Joseph story was written. So with this recognition, letting the question lie there because everybody knows who it is, with that Joseph hurried out because he was overcome with affection. And the root word here, rachamav here, the kumar is the root word, only here in Genesis, and we see it only 3 other times. The great medieval interpreter Rashi interprets it as was heated, sighing Lamentations verse, the shriveling effect of emotion from Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg. Wenham suggests his affection for his brother boiled up, which is how I translated here on the right side. So this heated sense of becoming overwhelmed with feeling for him. And again, highlighting an element I've been highlighting throughout this, and also in my series on the books of Samuel, where David often has emotion, as do other people. The Israelite view of things, the biblical view of things, is not that strong men don't cry. Men cry throughout, and affection is not hidden. That sense of denying feeling comes from the Greek philosophical ideas that populated Christianity and then get applied back to the Bible. But the Hebrew Bible and the Jewish tradition is not anti-emotion, and it certainly doesn't suggest that, quote, real men don't cry. Joseph could hardly be any more of a real man controlling the power he has in that traditional sense, and yet he has all this feeling. The reason he's not showing it isn't because he's ashamed, but because he doesn't want them to know it's him yet. So as he was about to weep, he went off literally into a bedchamber, is how I translated over here, and wept there. And we can recognize this as a big house. As I showed last time, you can see this similar image. This is not just somebody's house. This is the house of the second in command of all Egypt. And the very title Pharaoh means great house. Not just the physical house, but the entire house of the people of Egypt. So who knows what the brothers are thinking when he goes off into the private room? Do they think he went to the bathroom? It's amazing that we don't hear anything from them. They're looking at each other. Where did he go? And what are they supposed to do? The meal hasn't been served yet. They've just had this brief exchange, and he's now left. But he comes back and washes his face. And that might seem like nothing, but it recalls a couple of things. It recalls that when Joseph was taken out of the dungeon, it didn't say he washed his face, but it did say he shaved and changed his clothes. But the word for wash that you can see down there is otherwise only for feet. The invitation to wash the feet of the visitors back in chapter 18, Lot's invitation to have the same visitors wash their feet, and the invitation in chapter 24 from Laban to have Abraham's visitor wash his feet once he saw the jewelry and the camels. And then we just saw it in just the previous scene. So it's otherwise been for washing feet, but now it's washing face. And I want to highlight that too, because washing feet often involves other people doing it, but Joseph is all alone. And that's emphasized in the next verse that we'll look at now. So controlling himself, and that's literally what the word means. We see it one more time in Genesis and a few other times elsewhere. He said, serve the meal. And what we note here is there's the implicit presence of the servants, but they're never named, and in some places they're even in the passive voices we see down in 34, to make them basically invisible, as servants are supposed to be in elite circumstances, but to make it feel much more like Joseph and his brothers are having a private meal until we get to this verse. Let's read the verse, then we'll look at the sequence of notes I have on it. So they served him by himself, or alone or apart, and the same word is used 3 times, so I translated it consistently here. They served him alone, and them alone, and the Egyptians who ate with them alone. And that might be shocking to us because we're thinking, isn't there going to be a great meal where Joseph and his brothers, especially with Benjamin, all eat together? But now we're given the reason. And it's not the narrator's reason, as Sternberg helps us know, it's the Egyptian reason. As Sternberg notes, the double key clause, the key meaning because, the double key clause suggests that this is not the narrator's view, but an indirect quotation, even a quote mind reading of the Egyptians' thought known to Joseph, but not to anyone else at the table. And here it is, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, or literally could not eat bread with Hebrews. And calling them Hebrews here, the only plural time in Genesis was earlier in chapter 40, but this anticipates the many times in the Exodus. And I've been highlighting again from a different book from Sternberg, Hebrews is an ethnic slur word. The proper word to refer to these people is the Israelites, at least later. At the moment, Israelites is simply literally the sons of Israel, which are these people and nobody else. The idea that they're understood as Hebrews at this point is an interesting thing, but that simply means foreigners or crossers. It may well be that the Egyptians don't understand Hebrew as an ethnic group, but simply a label, as we might say, refugees. They would not eat with immigrants. Precisely the opposite of what we see in Leviticus, where the Israelites and the Judahites are ordered to care for them because you were once immigrants in Egypt. And so a very different lifestyle here, not the same covenant. And that really highlights an element of what might happen if they end up settling in Egypt. They would be by themselves and perceived as lesser by the Egyptians. For that is an abomination to the Hebrews. Let's go back and look at the notes on the verse here. So as my note has, the meal is described from the Egyptian point of view. The viceroy cannot eat with common folk, and the Egyptians cannot eat with Hebrews. Suddenly one realized that Joseph has been eating alone the entire time he's been with Egypt. As Sternberg notes, to reconcile the opposing forces of race and rank, the dinner space gets equivocally as well as multiply partitioned into a crisscross of tiny heterocosms, each little group by themselves. And then as he continues, this verse is the single most important prefiguration of the Exodus theme and conflict, which is that the Egyptians see the Hebrews as an abomination, at least to eat with them. Sternberg continues, within the drama and progress between Joseph and his brothers, its sundry incongruities call for notice. The defocusing of the present scene leads up to the wider focus ahead, same actors, new roles, and alignments. And as he notes even farther, that's again from Sternberg, reminding us of 41:51, what God has helped Joseph to forget, the Egyptians remember at every meal, back to here, that God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. But the fact that he eats every meal separately highlights you may wear an Egyptian outfit and you may have an Egyptian name, you may have an Egyptian wife, but you're still not an Egyptian. Much like Lot in Sodom, who refer to the Sodomites as brothers, but they say you came here as a stranger and a foreigner and you're going to tell us. And yet Joseph is telling the Egyptians, and we get to chapter 47, he won't just tell them, he'll sell them. And we'll see that there. So then we get to the actual meal, and it's not clear whether they're eating alone in separate rooms or simply at separate tables, but we're going to discover that they are at tables they can each see each other. So when they were seated before him, or literally at his face, which is the point there, then we hear this, the firstborn according to his birthright. Recalling the Bakora all the way back to the trick that Jacob did on his brother Esau to get it in the first place. And as we discussed in chapter 25, the birthright did not seem to really matter, at least not to matter in the sense that it would divide twin brothers. It was just a tradition. But here, the Egyptians highlight something that we had thought was an Israelite tradition, although they weren't Israelites yet. We don't know in Genesis 25 where exactly the tradition comes from. It's just stated as a given. But here, the Egyptians know it. It doesn't say that Joseph did this, but plainly Joseph's calling the shots. So the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. The men looked at one another more than in amazement, were stunned, as my note has below here. As Wenham notes, a strong reaction to something both unexpected and unpleasant, a manifestation of divine judgment. So seating them all that way, they're confused, and it's even more confusing here, although the response seems otherwise. Portions were taken, and notice the portions again 3 times in the verse. The passive voice renders the servants invisible. Portions were taken, masoth here, to them from Joseph's table, except that's not in the Hebrew, so I didn't have that here. Were taken to their faces. So there's no sense of a separate Joseph's table. But Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. Can they not notice that? Notice they're stunned before that happens. What reason can they imagine why this Egyptian vizier would give their youngest brother 5 times as much food? Maybe they could put 2 and 2 together and ask, why did he want to see Benjamin so much in the first place? And why is this happening? But instead of asking questions, they drank and were not merry with him. They were drunk with him, using the exact same word that Noah was when his sons one of his sons sees his nakedness, and the others come and cover it. And plainly, he was plenty drunk there. So instead of asking questions, they're drinking and getting drunk with this man they think is the Egyptian vizier, not having any sense that he's completely in charge of this, and he's got one more trick up his sleeve, which we'll see next time. See you for that then. Bye-bye.